This is an experiment which was developed in the course of conversations with Peter Morozov, who was a retired Marine officer who spent much of his career in the Marines as a doctrine writer. So he knows a lot about doctrine, about the way doctrine works. And doctrine has an ethical component, training has an ethical component, the structure of the military has an ethical component. And I'm here speculating about the way in which doctrine might be used to solve ethical problems in the military. And examples would be the My Lai massacre in the Vietnam War, for instance, which was an ethical disaster for the military. Military doctrine is sometimes defined by means of the phrase how we fight. It specifies how we fight. And very early pre-codification examples of military doctrine. So in other words, examples of military doctrine in the customary era. Just as there is an era in the law, which is customary law, which precedes the codification of law, so there is doctrine of military which existed before that doctrine was codified. The English archers fighting in Agincourt, they followed rules, and these rules could be easily communicated, but they didn't need to be written down. They were communicated orally. The problem is that as the military grew larger, you couldn't rely on oral communication anymore. You had to rely on some kind of written communication. As the written communication became more and more complicated, you needed codification as to how to deal with written communication also. An example would be if you're using firearms, cannon for instance, artillery, then it's not enough if you just tell the person who is actually controlling the people who are using the cannon that you're about to send large projectiles in a certain direction. There might be hundreds or thousands of other people who need to be informed that you're going to do that at a certain time, either because they might otherwise get hit, or because they need to know what you're about to do so that they can plan what they're going to do next as a result of the effects of what you just did. It was in artillery, actually, that the most pressing recognition of the need for doctrine first manifested itself. Besieging a fortress or organizing an encampment in readiness for attacking a fortress, and how to deploy infantry so that you could most effectively defend or attack against specific kinds of enemies and so on. These things started to be written down, and eventually that led to the joint doctrine hierarchy. Now the first puzzle, and this is part of my thesis in this particular presentation, is why is US doctrine published? Why is it made available on the internet for anybody? Why can you buy it on Amazon? Surely you would want to keep your military doctrine secret, because otherwise the enemy will find out what your doctrine is and they will be able to take account of it in planning how to defeat you. The first reason is that the purpose of doctrine, as I said before, is training to ensure coordination, not just of action but also of understanding, use of language. And now you want to ensure efficient and reliable field communication. What that means is you want to ensure everybody who's involved in any given communicational loop knows exactly what the appropriate way of speaking and of understanding is at any given time. And if you have a complicated collection of doctrinal publications, not just the 88 joint publications, but the thousands of Army publications, field manuals, technical manuals, and so on, then there's no way of ensuring that everyone is on the same page at any given time unless it's all public. If some of it is hard to get to, some people who need to get to it will not get to it in the right cycle, and there will be consequences. So the second reason why the US published all its doctrine is because the revising activity is so important. So particularly when military technology is advancing, military IT is advancing at such rapid pace, doctrine itself is needing to be revised at a more rapid pace. And you're only going to succeed in keeping the consistency of the whole through a process of increasingly rapid revisions on different cycles of different parts of doctrine, if you have the whole of doctrine at any given time, including the proposed revisions in the public domain. All right, and they are subject to constant revision. So, and you can see from 1997 to 2015 how much change went on just in that 15-year period. There was a time before around 1906 when people did not know how to do massing of fires. They were not able to mass fires. And what massing of fires means is that you have 4 artillery units distributed across a geographical area, and they're all going to fire their cannon, or whatever it might be, on the same spot at the same time. That's called massing of fire. Now, you can do this easily now. You have radios, walkie-talkies, or you have laptops and servers and email and messaging, and your laptops and your artillery are all connected together through battlefield internet. But in the olden days, they didn't have any of those things. You can imagine how difficult it would be to coordinate massing of fires. You have to have very accurate clocks. You have to have very, very well-trained troops. And you have to train them and train them and train them in such a way that you can get them to perform what they need to perform in the right kind of way. And that was a long-term process. This is a picture of it. In 1906, we have the first documented example of people who had the capability of massing fire. Each case of massing fires involves people with different specialisms. Some of them are observers, some of them are tuners of the artillery, some of them are loading the artillery, some of them are commanding the artillery, some of them are organizing communication between the different artillery units, some of them are in headquarters, and so people could do it already in 1906, but the doctrine for doing it only appeared 33 years later. A lot of what needed to be done was written down, but there was no doctrine. And once you have doctrine, then you can start refining it. You can make it better. And if you discover ways of making it better, you can refine the doctrine, which gives you then a new plateau from which to start new refinements. And that's what's been happening ever since. And now you can do the same thing with massing intelligence fires. So people say that the reason why the intelligence community did not predict 9/11 is because they had all the individual pieces of information, but they weren't able to connect the dots. So they knew about these or those terrorists, that they were doing these or those strange things. Other people knew similar strange things about those and those terrorists. They didn't put that information together. Exactly the same kind of governance and training is needed if we're going to train intelligence analysts to see where they need to join information together, and that means also changing the governance of the intelligence agencies themselves, some of which has happened. All right, I mentioned this definition of interoperability, and if we're going to provide interoperability across the entire military today, then we have a good starting point with joint doctrine, and we have a good starting point with joint dictionary. But as I've already said, this only works for human beings. John Searle has an idea about the social world which gives language the primary responsibility for creating certain kinds of social artifacts. So language has nothing to do with creating pregnancy, but it has a lot to do, he says, with creating things like families, marriage, inheritance, baptism, court cases involving people being accused, contracts or treaties being ratified, and so on. And what he says is that when we perform speech acts of certain sorts, then we change the world. The ontology of the social world, including claims, obligations, commitments, and so on, is created, he says, through the use of language. And when he says speech acts, in some cases it's not speech acts, it's document acts. I would say that Searle is correct, but that you can formulate it better. Language doesn't just describe, it creates and partly constitutes what it both describes and creates. I would say that codification shapes and enables the refinement of social practices over time, because the codifications can be revised in small steps, and individuals and families and organizations can thereby be shaped through these small steps in refinement of the codifications. Now, the codifications are the documents. Searle doesn't get that part. He doesn't see how by refining in the realm of documents we can improve behavior or change behavior. And now what I'm going to try and claim next is that we can improve the ethical behavior of warfighters by refining doctrine. In fact, that's what the Army is doing all the time. Military training is an amazing people-shaping activity. So remember, the title of this lecture is Building an Ethical Warfighter. Building a warfighter is what training does. Training and Doctrine Command uses the Army Doctrine hierarchy to build and shape not just individual troops, but teams of troops. And this is what itself says. TRADOC designs the future army. TRADOC builds the army by finding the 1% who are willing to serve and using its talented drill sergeants, instructors, and world-class facilities to turn them into trusted professionals. So these are not my words now. This is what TRADOC, this is how TRADOC describes itself. Now, part of training nowadays is a computational activity. So video games are a very important tool for military training. And Army Doctrine Reference Publication number 1 is about the Army profession. First of all, you train them in military expertise, which is, it says, our ethical application of land power. So even military expertise has an ethical dimension, as the Army conceives. And then you train them in honourable service, so a noble calling to service and sacrifice. Then you train them in trust, so they trust each other, they trust their commanders, they understand what their commander says because they've been trained in the language, but that means also they've been trained in the ethical use of the language. And trust between soldiers and leaders, between soldiers, their families and the army, between the army and the American people. So all of this is reference publication number 1, and it's all about ethical foundations. So the army is already building ethical warfare. And as I say, video games are being used at every organizational level in the military for recruiting soldiers, training soldiers, and treating their psychological disorders. Now, how does it work? Well, you have drill, but you also have certification. This is more documents. So you certify that a certain warfighter has been through a certain drill and has been evaluated. So you go through simple drill, and then you go through drill in teams, experience of coordinated action, and then you have evaluation, and then you have experience of command, and then you have evaluation. So at every stage in the training you have evaluation, then you have more training, more evaluation. And the whole thing is a growing process. You're creating professionals. You start with an oath of service. So you promise to do certain things. That's a speech act. But all of this certification is document acts. People very often criticize doctrine. They say, doctrine is all very well, but as soon as you get into some battlefield situation, you're not going to care about doctrine. You're going to care about what's going on around you, and you'll throw doctrine out the window. Now that's not true. First of all, it's not true because you still want to be able to understand what your commander says. And you still want to be able to respond quickly to what your commander says because of how you've been trained. But more importantly, for our present purposes, you still want to have judgment and initiative and loyalty and trust and all of those other things, even in a very, very urgent battlefield situation. You need to be trained to be loyal and trustworthy, even in the most extreme of circumstances. And that means that you take an oath when you enlist it, but your commander is constantly forcing you to follow your oath in everything that you do, both in training and in actual operation. So we're creating teams here. we're creating teams by training them, but we're creating better teams by refining the documents that we use as the basis for our training. And then we have ranks and medals and all of those other things, rewards, all of which are designed to integrate soldiers into teams which will also behave ethically. The training nowadays includes training all the way with IT as part of everything that you do, basically. So video games are not just training in the sense that you are training how to respond to new situations in the video game. You're also using the video game to train you how to use equipment, which is computational equipment. It's built into your helmet. Now what that is doing is it's putting you through the same repeated situation over and over again when firing inside a simulated village, for instance, where there may be civilians and enemy troops that you're going to need to be able to respond to very quickly. You're going through simulations of such environments, firing simulations of weapons in front of your screen. And by doing that 1,000 times over, you are becoming neurologically re-engineered to become progressively integrated with your IT systems. It's like learning how to play the piano, which we've been doing since the 14th century. That was also neurological re-engineering. The idea is that you are creating troops who are meshed together in teams, who are meshed together with IT artifacts, which are also meshed together with both the individual soldiers and with the teams. The commanders use IT artifacts which are linked to the IT artifacts used by the warfighter. The whole thing it can be really complicated with many commanders at different levels, at different modules. So there's a smaller module, another small module, another small module. They form a larger module, and then there are other large modules, each with their commanders, forming a hierarchy. And the whole thing is able to perform intelligent action under very, very extreme circumstances because of all the drill and the modularization which enables the expertise acquired during the drill to work effectively. And to do that, you need hierarchically organized authorities. The commanders need to be working together as teams also. They need to have trust in their commanders. And then finally, you need plans which the organized authorities are putting into effect. And the plans too have to be meshed. All right, so what the army is doing is building human beings who are skilled in military expertise, who fit into teams. They are technologically fit in the sense that they are integrated with the IT systems that they are wearing and that they are surrounded by. They are being evaluated constantly so that they're doing all of these things properly, and they get rewarded and promoted according to how well they do in those evaluations. And now all of this involves an ethical component, which we saw at every level. And so all of this means building an ethical human being, but now all of this is based on doctrine. And if you refine doctrine, then the starting point will be the existing ethical human beings, but the next stage will be an even more ethical human being, because we're going to keep repeating this, creating better and better human beings. So one could argue that the army personnel are the most ethical human beings that there are, because they have the most efficient, systematic, intensive, ethically based training program of any organization in the world. I wouldn't argue that, but one could. This is an example of a video game training system used to teach morality. And there are other people who are designing games for ethics, as they call them. So now this brings us back to our question: why do we publish practically all our doctrine? So some countries publish lots of it, but no one gets even close to the US in publishing all its joint doctrine. I think that one reason is that they want the public to see the trust and loyalty built into military doctrine. And if it's in the public domain, then the public can see it. People don't normally look, of course. So I think that there is a kind of public-facing aspect to all of this. And you can see that if you look at the front covers of the Army Doctrine particularly. They're facing towards the outside world. So, and the idea is that by exposing military doctrine to public critique, we are getting the extra benefit of having problems pointed out to us by a larger audience. So what I'm talking about is a strategy to avoid My Lai massacres in the future. The idea is that because of the My Lai massacre, the doctrine was changed. So now the My Lai massacre kind of unethical behavior is ruled out. The troops are trained in such a way that and the commanders, I always include commanders under the heading of troops, they've been trained in such a way that will never happen again. There might be some new scandal, and then we'll need to rewrite doctrine to remove the possibility of that kind of scandal happening again. And gradually we are building more ethical troops, trained to behave in ways which rule out certain kinds of unethical behavior.